Jane was in her final year of veterinary school and had a part-time job as a pet store saleswoman. One evening, as usual after her shift, she closed the store and hurried home. On the subway platform, she saw a young man sitting in a wheelchair and begging for alms. His eyes were very sad and his face was wrinkled and exhausted beyond his years. The guy was dressed very poorly. Jane walked past him and suddenly there was a noise and clanking of metal behind her. The girl turned around and saw that the guy with his wheelchair had tipped over backwards and was lying on the platform. Apparently, a group of young teenagers walking right behind her had hit him on purpose or accidentally, and he fell and remained lying there, unable to get up. Jane ran over to the guy, picked up the wheelchair, and helped him into it. The young man was embarrassed and thanked Jane for her help. When the girl offered to get him home, he sharply declined and drove in the opposite direction from Jane. Jane did not hesitate long and caught up with the guy, and without saying a word, simply took the handles of the wheelchair and wheeled him along the platform. The young man looked at the girl with his sad eyes, thanked her again, and then introduced himself as Kyle. Jane smiled and, to ease the awkward silence, asked why he was alone on the subway. Kyle showed Jane the direction, and while they were driving, he told her his story. 2 years ago, he had been in a car accident. That evening, he was rushing to see his girlfriend. He drove through an intersection at a yellow light, and a truck crashed into his car. Then there was the hospital, a long and almost ineffective rehabilitation, and in the end, a wheelchair. And worst of all, the girlfriend he was in such a hurry to see abandoned him when she found out what had happened to him. Hearing all this made Jane feel very sorry for the guy. She was a kind person, and she wanted to do something helpful for Kyle. By this time they had arrived at the house where Kyle lived. Jane was uncomfortable, but she asked if he got any kind of job. The young man answered honestly that he lived on his allowance, the help of caring neighbours, and, in especially desperate moments, even had to ask for alms. With these words, Kyle looked at Jane with his sad look of a doomed man, then said goodbye and drove into the driveway. Jane got back on the subway and went home. All the way home, she thought about the poor guy. The girl was living alone. Her father had died 2 years ago, and her mother passed away when Jane was very young. The girl was single. In her 22 years, she was unmarried and hadn't even dated anyone. The next day, Jane told the store owner that she had a person for the position of cage cleaner. The owner agreed and asked Jane to bring him in for a conversation. Now all the girl had to do was talk Kyle into it. The same evening after work, she went into the store and bought a couple of shirts, pants and a jacket. Jane went down to the subway and saw Kyle at the same place. The girl walked up to him and put the bag of clothes on his lap. Kyle looked at her questioningly, and Jane happily told him that she had found him a job in a pet store where she worked, and the animals there really needed someone to look after and feed them. Kyle was amazed at her compassion and at what she had done for him. When he asked why Jane was helping him, she simply said it was because he required help. And besides, she remembered well the words of her father, "By helping others, you help yourself." 2 days later, Kyle arrived to the pet store. The shopkeeper sympathetically looked at him and briefly explained him his duties. At the beginning, Jane helped the guy, but soon he learned the work and refused her help, deciding to do everything himself. A month passed, and Kyle got his first salary, and he was thrilled about it. In the evening, he invited Jane for a walk, and she agreed. They went to the cinema and then took a long walk around the city. That is how their first date was. Soon their friendship turned into a romantic relationship. Jane liked this simple guy with a kind heart and a hard fate. 6 months later, Jane suggested Kyle living together. It would be more comfortable, and she wouldn't have to worry about him being alone without her. One night, Kyle had a terrible dream and fell out of bed. When he told Jane that immediately after the fall he felt pain in his leg, the girl clapped her hands for joy. She was now certain it was not that hopeless. They went to a rehabilitation center, and Kyle, to his great joy, was able to get back on his feet. It cost a lot of money, but Jane and Kyle made it. Now the guy walked on crutches, albeit slowly, but without a wheelchair. A few more months passed, and another incredible event happened. Jane left the store early to prepare for exams, and Kyle still stayed to work. When the workday was over, Kyle went to the grocery store, bought some fruit, and slowly walked home. Suddenly, a pickup truck drove out of the corner and collided with a passing car at an intersection. The car overturned and gasoline began pouring out of the tank. Kyle froze in horror, as if it was the same accident that put him in the wheelchair. It was counting down to seconds. Kyle came to his senses and, not realizing what he was doing, threw off his crutches and ran to the car. He smashed the window and opened the door. There was an elderly woman behind the wheel, whom he pulled out with difficulty and tried to pull her away to the curb. But she began to break away and yell hysterically that her granddaughter had been sitting behind her. Kyle shouted at her to move away and was instantly back in the car. A girl of about 6 was crying between the seats, and the guy had a hard time freeing her. The flames grew stronger and stronger, and Kyle understood that he had to get away from the car as quickly as possible. Fortunately, he made it in time. They barely ran 5 meters away from the car when there was an explosion. The girl and her grandmother were crying with shock and happiness that they were alive, and Kyle was sitting on the curb and was also coming to his senses. Soon the fire department and ambulance arrived, as well as reporters who were filming a report and taking interviews. When one of the police officers saw the crutches, he asked who it belonged to. Kyle touched his legs in surprise and said that they were his crutches, but he probably wouldn't need them anymore. At that moment, a reporter came up to him, put a microphone in his hands, and asked how he felt after his feat. Kyle modestly replied that any man in his position would have done the same, and then, looking straight into the camera, he asked Jane to marry him. The young people got married a week later. They were celebrating with friends in a small cafe when suddenly 3 people entered. Kyle immediately recognized the elderly woman and the girl he had pulled out of the burning car, but the third person he didn't know. It was an older man in an expensive suit. The man walked up to Kyle, thanked him for saving his wife and granddaughter, and handed the young couple a thick envelope. "This is your wedding present." Inside the envelope was money enough for the young couple to start a new, happy life.